Okay, gluttony. This is the final sin. It's not the final sin for Dante. The final sin for Dante was lust. It's not the final sin for Evagrius or Cassian or Gregory the Great, or in fact anyone, but it is the final sin for us, okay? Partly this is every commentator on the 7 deadly sins is allowed to put their own stamp. And for me, I just think it's the weakest of the sins. The one with the least, I suppose, the least morally reprehensible in the modern world. So that's why I think if it's a 21st century survey of the 7 deadly sins, gluttony should come last. We are going to consider gluttony from 4 different angles. Really, the main problem for us is this question about what is the morality of food in the Middle Ages. There is a deep and slightly twisted, I think, morality of food and consumption of food in the Middle Ages that we need to confront. A broader question we might confront is, are all moralizations of food themselves, the ones that we have in the modern world, are they relatable to the medieval? Are they at some level theological? Can they all be brought back to this concept of what is a sin? 4 things, then. Forbidden fruit will be our first. We need to look at this concept that gluttony really is the first of the sins. That there's this theory in medieval theology that it's the first sin that you suffer, that human beings suffered. In fact, it's the sin that led us into the mess that we're in right now, is wanting to eat more. By studying the forbidden fruit, and of course we're talking about the Garden of Eden, more specifically, we need to study what gluttony means in this context, because how can it be that eating a small part of an apple is gluttony? How is that gluttony? Then we need to move on to decadence and drink. We need to get some basic facts out of the way about what people were eating in the Middle Ages, how much they were eating, and what was decadent, what was considered decadent, and where do you draw that line? Then we will talk about feast and fast. We will talk about the peculiar aspects of medieval theology and medieval Christian practice that relate to food, that relate to, on the one hand, the holy feast, which is, of course, the Eucharist, drinking the blood of Jesus, eating the body of Jesus, as absurd as that is for most onlookers who aren't Christian. And, of course, fasting too, emaciation of self. And finally, we will talk about some anxieties and fixations, food anxieties. In fact, we'll talk about the modern world. We'll talk about today. Throughout all of this, there will be some modern theory and modern philosophy. There will be a little bit of biopolitics. I'm glad Julie's just arrived. You can help us out with that. There will be a little bit of other kinds of political commentaries. And what we'll try and identify is a few moments where you see moralizations about food become deeply connected with other forms of prejudice and political experience of the world, when to moralize about food really becomes a way to speak about the class system, or really becomes a way to speak about education, or really becomes a way to sort of damn people, I suppose. We'll look at that. Okay, so those are the 4 things. We need to begin then with forbidden fruit. We need to begin in Eden, with the very beginning of humanity, at the very beginning of human failing. How can it be that this moment was a moment of gluttony? If you think about this moment, and it's written about by commentators, obviously it survives, it's from the Old Testament, it's the primal moment in 3 religions, in Islam and Judaism too. So the simple act of temptation, there's an apple, or not an apple, as we'll discover in a second. There's some fruit of some kind that Adam and Eve eat, and it's a moment of temptation. How on earth is it gluttony? Well, it's not really gluttony, is it? Archon, is it gluttony? I mean, it's... I deliberately pick on you because you're busy doing something else. Is it a moment of gluttony, eating from the forbidden fruit? Was that gluttony? It's definitely gluttony. It's not pride or lust. It's pride. We've seen this moment, if you remember, way back with the pride lecture 6 weeks ago. Augustine coded this as a moment of pride, as Valeria reiterates. You know, because you think you know better. I want to have the knowledge.
By the way, he didn't take responsibility for that.
The lack of responsibility is the problem. That sounds like pride again. But gluttony, what do we imagine gluttony as being without diving into medieval theology? Isn't it eating too much? Isn't it? If he ate the whole tree, if they'd eaten all of the apples on the tree, we could say this is gluttony. Gluttony is the sin. And God said, you shouldn't have eaten all the apples. I told you not to eat all the apples. But he didn't say, don't eat all the apples. He said, don't eat any of them, or don't begin. Well, this is a problem. We'll get there in a second, but I think it reveals some fundamental difference in how medieval people thought about gluttony and how we think about gluttony. Just first of all, to confirm that this moment is seen as gluttony. Here's Chaucer in the Pardoner's Tale, which you read a couple of weeks ago. O gluttony full of cursedness, O cause first of our confusion, original of our damnation, till Christ have bought us with his blood again. Lo, how dear, shortly for to say, was such cursed villainy. Corrupt was all this world for gluttony. First of our confusions, original of our damnation. This is explicitly a reference to Eden. Chaucer's not the only one, of course. Notice that all of this is saved by blood. So one form of corrupt eating, gluttony, is saved by another form of pure or divine moral eating, which is the Eucharist, which we'll come to later. Eating, but not just Chaucer. By the way, here's the moment of eating. As you can see, it's not all the apples. Still fairly svelte. Obviously didn't eat everything. Let's look at, for example, Jacob of Wells. These are a series of sermons from the early 1400s. They're wonderful, full of moralization. The devil seeks the throat of man by gluttony, as the wolf seeks the sheep, just as he took Adam and Eve when they ate the apple. Again, gluttony, Adam and Eve. Why? Why this fixation? It seems that it's something about the quality of eating or something about the intention of eating rather than the quantity or the manner, at least in some corners of theology. Is it the object itself? What was the fruit in Eden? This is a great debate. Well, it's not a great debate, actually. It's a debate. What was the fruit? What was the fruit? All we see in the Bible is it's the fruit. I've heard tell that apples were inedible at this point. I remember Duskin used to tell us about, the modification of the apple and how it's impossible that it could have been an apple, blah, 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 which is quite good. It could have been anything. Here's a fresco from the 12th century. What fruit is it here? Not really a fruit at all. It seems to be an enormous mushroom. Yeah, an enormous mushroom that these guys are eating. So actually the imagination runs wild. There have even been suggestions that it was banana, which I'm sure carries other thoughts. I mean, how exotic, how not European. I don't know, do bananas grow in the Levant? Does anyone know? Where is Eden is the next question, I suppose. Is Eden in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in which case this would make sense? The point is, and here we can go to possibly Hildegard let's go to Cassian himself. The point is, again, it's not the thing that is eaten necessarily, or the amount that is eaten. In this early theology, it is the manner of eating. And as Cassian tells us, the first conflict we must enter is that against gluttony, which we explained as the pleasure of the palate. So, all right, so our initial definition could be perhaps that it's not the amount that you eat, it's the pleasure that you get from eating. So there's a pathologization of pleasure. Of course, what is that pleasure? Well, you see, it's complex. In this Eden moment, obviously the pleasure is the forbidden aspect of it. The pleasure comes precisely in the fact that it is forbidden fruit or forbidden food. So there's obviously some, and of course, what's forbidden and what's not. You will see that there are some medieval moralizations that explore that boundary of what is forbidden and make the sin of gluttony really about the overstepping of boundaries or the transgression of what authority says is right or wrong. So there is an authority issue. Notice for Cassian, because gluttony was the first sin, it's also the first sin that we have to fight in our battle against the seven deadly sins. You remember for Cassian, the seven deadly sins must be fought in combat. They're a battle. They are an enemy that we have to fight. Whereas for Evagrius, it's much more gentle. Seven deadly sins are actually 8 thoughts that come to us naturally, that drift into our minds because we're human. It's not really a battle. We just have to resist and fortify ourselves. For Cassian, it's a battle. I suppose what I'm getting at here is what we're not seeing. What are we not seeing? What's the absent thing in all of these early pathologizations of gluttony? The absent thing is a fixation on the index of food on the body. There's nothing about fatness or growth or excess in this particular strain. Gluttony is a problem insofar as it transgresses, insofar as it is something forbidden. It's not a sin of an excessiveness of something good. And so we could go, for example, to Hildegard of Bingen, who you all remember. We've read different parts of her work. This is The Cause and Cure, which is a medical treatise. And why this quote? Those with fat flesh will harm themselves with water baths because they are warm and moist within. The point here, the reason I show you this, is because the idea of a corpulence, of an excessive body weight, for Hildegard of Bingen is a naturalization. It's completely natural. It's because of the humoral composition of the body. It's not because of what you've done. It's not because you've eaten so much. It's because your body is more warm and moist. You have a certain combination which makes you larger than others. That's not to say that medieval writers are not aware of the fact that if you eat a huge quantity of food that you will become larger. It's not at all. But that's not the major issue necessarily for everyone when it comes to gluttony. So later on in the lecture, we'll start to think about this issue of fat or overweight or obese or whichever term you use, and how that's moralized in the present. It does become slightly moralized in some corners of medieval theology, but at its base, if we look at the first writers on gluttony, that's not the issue, which is interesting. All right, let's go to our second section, decadence. Because if it's not the quantity always, then it can sometimes be the quality or the decadent nature of what you're eating. I suppose one thing to say here is just as much as gluttony is not always associated with an excessive amount of food, it's not also solely associated with food, it is also, of course, drink. How much do people drink in the Middle Ages? Anyone? Alcohol, I mean. Any guesses? You must, it's simple calculation. You know, once, this is one of my favourite pieces of medieval economic history. They calculated the amount of land that was left over to grain production, how much land was in barley production. You know that it used to be that, and actually this is a little bit later, but obviously you'd have to rotate crops, right? So if you want wheat, you're going to have some barley every 3 years to refresh the ground. And so there was an excess amount of barley. But anyway, beyond that, before that, and then of course that leads to people promoting consumption of alcohol because we need to get rid of it, need to use all this barley. And might as well drive it into making profits. That is a little bit later. In the Middle Ages, though, someone did, and this is my favourite piece of medieval economic work, they did a calculation. How much land is given over to barley production? Okay, and how much is being exported? How much have we got records of being used internally and so on? And anyway, the calculation came out to a certain amount of barley per person, and then they calculated that. And it turns out it's something like 8 pints of beer per person per day. This is roughly the calculation. It's really difficult to know because it does... Sorry?
What is a pint?
Oh, a pint is half a litre. So that's 4 litres a day per person. This is corroborated by some other records, like you see how much wine is given over to like guards who are being paid in kind, and it'll be something like 3 litres per person per night and things like that, which is quite interesting. I suppose spillage, they take account of that. There's a lot being eaten, drunk. Children are drinking at breakfast time alcohol or beer, small amounts of beer. I mean, what's the reason for this? There is access to drinking water. It's not like the water table is completely polluted, but one explanation is it's much safer, more reliable, easier. It's not completely the story that everyone's just drinking alcohol and not water. It is complicated, and there is wine to take into account. There's not much in the way of spirits, certainly in Northern Europe at this point. Anyway, people are drinking a lot. Does this mean that there's a different threshold for pathologization of drinking? Well, yes, at some level, yes, there is. Small amounts, low levels of drinking are not made into a moral issue. We don't see moralizations about just drinking at all. Whether you drank any alcohol or not, I don't think I've ever seen that in the sources as a problem. It's the excessiveness which is the problem with alcohol. Piers Plowman is an example. This is a 14th century poet. He's nothing on Dante, I'm sorry to say, I don't think, William Langland, but it's a similar kind of journey. It's William himself falls asleep on the Morven Hills and then has all of these visions of all these different... he has all these moral encounters. So he meets, for example, in one of these encounters, the figure of Gluttony himself. And it's a pretty typical description. The only thing I would say is you see here gluttony is exclusively associated with drunkenness in this account. Glutton is another name for a drunk. There followed a good round of laughter and much pulling of faces. So this is when Glutton, the character, enters the tavern. Tavern being a higher class, by the way, drinking establishment. Tavern, ale house, there's a kind of hierarchy. So Glutton goes in, much pulling of faces, cries raised of let the drinks go round, a great deal of bartering and imbibing of ale. The whole crowd sat there till the hour of evensong, bursting into song, blah, 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 till Glutton had succeeded in putting away rather more than a gallon down his gullet. So that would be a measure of, so a gallon is 8 pints. So there we go. You see, that's the kind of threshold that we're seeing pathologized. His guts now started to rumble, blah, blah, blah. He pissed, it should be 4 pints, I think. 4 pints in the time it takes to say one paternoster. So 4 pints is half a gallon. Okay, so he's doing quite well. He's still got a good capacity in his bladder. This is typical. Okay, so one thing to note then, all right, gluttony can mean drunkenness. But again, note the quantities. It's the gallon that's the problem here. It's interesting, just as a side note, that all of this leads to sloth in William Langland's model of the deadly sins. So actually you see gluttony leading to sloth. So it's not the beginning or the end point. Anyway, that's another issue, I suppose. How's gluttony punished in hell? You might have wondered this. I mean, because we've every single week we've looked at Dante and how he's punished the different sins. The funny thing for me, reading Dante's 6th canto, which is where we have the gluttons, the second circle of Inferno, the funny thing is actually Dante is just not interested in gluttony, which kind of fits with my feelings, not in the sense that I feel like the other sins are so much richer psychologically. Gluttony, I found it harder, but I think it's when you dig down, you do see some really interesting psychological shades. But Dante's not really interested. He actually makes his whole canto about greed and politics. But anyway, what is the punishment for gluttony? I was imagining before I'd read the Inferno that it was going to be gorging on too much food or something, like it would be a contrapasso in that sense. For some reason, no. Actually, the punishment is a really heavy, polluted rain that beats down on the gluttons. And so they keep constantly changing their body posture to try and keep the other side dry. Like maybe if I let this side of me get wet, this side won't be so polluted for a while. There is, of course, also a beast, Cerberus, three-headed dog, described as a worm, actually. This is William Blake's wonderful image of it. Yes, all right, so there is some kind of contrapasso. They are sort of ripped and gnashed at by this animal, I suppose. But why the rain? Purgatorio is much more direct and much more simple, really, as a punishment. This is the 6th terrace, the penultimate terrace in Purgatory on the mountain, and you can probably see from this 15th century image. You know, this is the Italian etymology of the human, homo, the word homo. Shame Giacomo's not here, because it can be read in the emaciated face. The I's are the O's, and the M is the emaciation, the bone structure showing an M. Dante describes these faces so emaciated that you could read human, homo, in their faces. It's quite a simple punishment, really. It's just an enormous tree of fruit that they can't reach, and they starve. It's fairly ingenious, though, the way this is done, and Dante gets kind of confused. Like, why are they starving? They haven't eaten anything for 10,000 years in the other parts of Purgatory. Why now suddenly are they starving? And so then there's this enormous backtracking, and Statius and Virgil have to explain, and they say, well, temporarily they're given the capacity for hunger just for the punishment. It's kind of the twistedness of Mount Purgatory. And their emaciation. Decadence, then. I mean, to go back to the question, of course, we should go to the author that influenced Dante so much, Aquinas. So far we've established that maybe there's not a connection between quantity and gluttony, as casual as we may have thought. And we've also seen that drinking is important in gluttony and excessiveness. We should go to Aquinas, and we can rely on Aquinas to give us a kind of catalogue of how all these things relate to one another. First of all, I would say that for Aquinas, quite simply, the vice of gluttony, it becomes mortal. It becomes a mortal sin when it results in you turning away from your last end, or in other words, your ultimate purpose, I suppose, which is good. So gluttony is okay. It's only a venial sin if you're just eating a little bit too much now and then, or the wrong things or whatever. But when it starts to consume you, when you start to turn away, when you make it your priority, I suppose. All right, so it's pretty simple with Aquinas. He has his four attributes of gluttony. And notice that how much is one of them. Okay, so the whatness, he really obsesses over this, the sumptuousness of food. If you become attracted to a certain sumptuousness, the quality of food becomes an issue for you. This is gluttony, number one for Aquinas. Note that this also means that you start to be fussy about how your food is prepared. So if I want it medium rare. I didn't want it rare, medium rare. This is already gluttony for Aquinas. The sumptuousness, the obsession. Yes, how much is an issue? He's simply eating too much. He doesn't dwell on that. It's not important for him, but it is there. He's someone who knew knew about that problem. I think this is the only vice that he actually suffered. The whenness is important, not waiting for the right time. What is the right time? Okay, so just being too hasty, being 5 minutes earlier in the queue for the lunch than you should be, or whatever, is a problem. Obviously, snacking between meals is an issue for Aquinas too. Then, and finally, the howness, eating too greedily, too ferociously, like the dog Cerberus, gnashing in a too animalistic or passionate a way, is a problem. Okay, so pretty simple. He is encountering the too much. I think that is interesting. That's the first time we really get a full statement on the quantity of your food being a problem, funnily enough, when you would have thought that was the first problem of gluttony. It only appears here in the 13th century scholastic mind, and possibly only because Aquinas was so obsessed with detail and covering all of the bases. Do you ever wonder why, or do you wonder why, looking at all of these, what the problem is with gluttony? Well, I mean, we'll talk about in a second. We have our own moralizations about gluttony, which I think you can conjure immediately. Certain images of clogged arteries, certain images of other kinds of moral degeneracy, especially with drunkenness, all kinds of other things, hormones being affected, bad behavior, death, all these things, maybe. Aquinas doesn't bring those to play. As you can understand, he's not going to say gluttony is deadly precisely because it will kill you. That's actually not his problem. His problem is what it does to your mind, not in a behavior sense. You can probably anticipate some of these. For him, all of this gluttony, all of this obsession with the quality of the food, the sumptuousness, causes a dullness of sense and understanding. Spend too much time worrying about how your steak is prepared, and you're really missing out on other things. Causes desires for unnecessary things. For Aquinas, it's like a drug in this sense. You become so concerned with this, so concerned with the kind of food that you're eating, fussy about how it's prepared and so on, that you end up getting a little bit fixated on all these unnecessary things. So your whole life you're going to be looking for, it's this attention to detail which is going to drag you down, of things that you don't really need to worry about, you start to worry about. I wish, my walls should be painted blue because, the living room is red and that would make a nice contrast. It's that kind of way of thinking that Aquinas worries will come upon you if you start worrying about things like, whether you prefer brown or white rice. Causes pointless levels of speech. This is an interesting one for Aquinas. He actually has an issue with this loquaciousness, too much speech. For a man who wrote 1 million words in his lifetime, I don't know. Mind you, they're not loquacious words, I have to admit. They're all pretty to the point. And of course, a sinful levity, departure from reason, as you would expect. The problem for Aquinas. It's funny, I always think with Aquinas you could take the word God out entirely of all his writing and write reason instead. The whole thing still works. A departure from reason, a departure from God, a departure from a proportioned and reasonable way of thinking, which he characterized with levity, which I think is harsh. He hasn't got anything nice to say about laughter at that moment. I think at this point, any questions about the medievals and their decadence? I'm not going to talk about the kinds of foods that they consider decadent or not, although, they are thinking about Eastern foods a lot of the time. They are thinking about certain spices as being decadent, as there being a morality connected, which it can be made into a cultural issue. Do we have the microphone? Oh, yes. I just get the sense that Artyom is...
And does it have some practical meaning that time? The shortage of food, the food wasn't available, in the amount we have now. And was it connected to, this practical thing that really the community should save food and, don't overeat? And they really sort of connected this practical approach to theological conception of gluttony as a sin. Can you comment on this?
Yes, there are. Well, first of all, what's interesting is that does not come through in the theology, which you might have expected it to. Like all of this overeating, you're depriving the poor, doesn't come up as an issue for the theologians. The people who do make that an issue are aristocrats who like to show off their, I'm going to donate this half of the table to the guys outside. You get absurd stories of, my favourite one is the aristocrats who have a big party and they say at the end, we're going to throw all of the plates and everything outside for the peasants. We're going to throw all the food. They actually have an enormous net to catch it all and then take it back. So this demonstration of your largesse, that would definitely be, that's all 7 of the sins at once. But yeah, so that doesn't come up in the theology. I'm fascinated by that. In the contemporary, we're going to think, we could think about parallels. Like, you must finish eating your food because there are starving people. This is like my childhood. Was it your childhood? Did you get the same? Everyone, okay. It wasn't just Britain and Ireland. I think the paradox always being no one actually puts their food in a box and sends it off to, well, of course not. It doesn't make sense. But how is it that you're overeating? Not you. How is it that one's overeating is helping? You know, so at least we don't get that argument here. I would say, because it's kind of a strange and hypocritical argument.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that time was pretty hard to overeat for the majority of people. No.
Hard to what? Sorry.
At that time, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was pretty hard thing to overeat for a majority of people, right? I think probably it's true for aristocracy, but.
You'd be surprised. There are times, of course, where it's impossible to even eat, let alone overeat. You know, the famine of 13, 15, 16, 17. But you'd be surprised. There are surpluses. There's enough discourse about people overeating anyway, and it's not just aristocrats and monks and priests, but they are like the common targets of overeating. What you don't see is the simple link between the size of a body and morality is not made there. You know, like fat as synonym for morally wayward or something like that doesn't ever come up, or not as much as you would expect. Okay, all right. So, okay, any other questions? Let's move on to, this is where I need Julie's help. Let's move on to biopower, biopolitics, because my question for the students really is it fair to see Thomas Aquinas as a biopolitical thinker? He's trying to regulate, or at least he's one of the agents of a Christian system of power, which is trying to regulate how your bodies will be, how your bodies will act, what your body should look like, ultimately. It makes me think of Foucault and biopower, which we can, or biopolitics, which he defines, you know, in The Will to Knowledge. A power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavours to administer, optimise and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. Is it fair to see Aquinas as doing precisely this? Is it, you know, is he trying to optimise the human body? There are millions of answers to that question, and we would have to go to paradise to look at it. I mean, there are lots of discourses on what the perfect body will look like in paradise. Otto of Freising, at the more insane, I think it's fair to use this word, maybe not, level of the spectrum, Otto of Freising supposes, he's a 12th century bishop, German bishop, says, well, maybe all bodies will look alike in paradise. There is a perfect body, and we will all have it in paradise. So we'll look less like ourselves. We'll all be the same height. All of these moles that I have that I'm not that keen on will be gone. All blemishes will be gone. Birthmarks will be gone. For Otto, this even goes to the point of saying, well, people who have dark skin will become white-skinned. It's a horrifying paradise in that respect. Not really paradise at all for most people. Are you even you in the paradise? If you have this other body, well, where's the you-ness gone? He even entertains the fact that women will become men in this paradise because surely everyone should have exactly the same holy body. But then eventually says, I'm not that extreme. Of course, women will still be women. But the debate is out there. Should the body conform? Is there a perfect ideal body to which all humans should be aspiring? For Thomas, it's not quite so clear. He doesn't necessarily say this is what you should look like, but certainly regulating how you eat, the manner, there is a certain norm which he's imposing. Is this biopolitical? Julie, is it biopolitical? Sorry to put you on the spot. There's a microphone.
Well, it's just the concept he uses for, and you can perfectly use this. He also has a concept of sovereign power, which is more, and the biopower is normally from 17th century, but or disciplinary power. But in terms of regulations of bodies, you can use it. It's just not something that establishes it, just the concept to describe. And certainly Aquinas is demonstrate this, that it's possible.
It doesn't come from a sovereign either, does it, I suppose?
Well, they're connected. It's just the same phenomena you can analyze from using different kinds of power. Sovereign, it also probably takes their care of the bodies in a weird way.
Care of bodies. Care that's a much gentler term than management or optimization. Care. Aquinas would see himself as caring, but the impetus to optimize is definitely there. All right, now we just skip for a bit of fun into the 21st century, and I suppose biopolitical attempts, what we might consider biopolitics in attempts to manage and optimize bodies. I mean, some of these are really obvious. I don't know how they resonate with the medieval ideas of gluttony. This is a brand new campaign. This is Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, contracted the coronavirus in, I think it was April or May. He was very sick. Actually, he was really seriously close to the edge. And recovering, he pledged that he would pay more attention to the problem of obesity, and that he saw the connection between obesity and susceptibility to COVID-19 as an issue. Here we have a campaign which was launched by the National Health Service, the British state health system. You know, this is my new thing, get help and support to lose weight. So it's an anti-obesity campaign, it, you know, promotes cycling and so on. I mean, the question you have with all this is, what does it serve? Well, here, you know, it's management and optimization of bodies. It obviously also serves, you know, don't put too much strain on the National Health Service. It can be reduced to economics. It can be reduced to a question of political management of bodies for economic efficiency. I wouldn't like to reduce it to that still. I love this cancer research campaign against obesity. Of course, this is, you know, like smoking. Obesity puts millions of adults at greater risk of cancer. This is a charitable organisation which is aligned with but not part of the state. Does it still constitute a biopolitical management of citizens? I don't know. Behind this, of course, there are people who condemn the idea of obesity as itself this great pathological problem, and that making it like smoking makes it like a choice, like you choose to pick up a packet of cigarettes or not. You can quit smoking, but some would argue there's a genetic dimension to obesity which has some relation to your choices, but has a lot of lack of relation to choices too. This was a very controversial campaign from Atlanta, Georgia. Big Bones Don't Make Me This Way, Big Meals did, explicitly confronting the environmental absolution of people who are larger, fat kids become fat adults, blah, blah, blah. This was extremely controversial, probably for reasons that you can see. More interesting biopolitical measures, I would say, are these ones. And this was a great debate, again, in Britain, in British supermarkets, about labelling and about the ethics of labelling food. So there was an act introduced that all food needs to be labelled with calorie and health content. Are you familiar with this? Do these happen in Russia? Yeah. They do? Yeah. Fantastic. By law. Do they use the same? Because the great debate here was about which system to use. This is the GDA system, and these were other systems introduced, the traffic light system. And a lot of companies like Kellogg's, the cereal, prefer this because it's less, you can see why, right? And yeah, it's just a simple pink sugar. This is okay. You know, it's pink, it's nice. Would we be turquoise or pink or yellow? This is obviously carries a much clearer moral message. Like red, stop, don't do it, it's dangerous or whatever, or yellow is danger, the colour of danger. There's a historian, Michel Pastore, who does a history of all the colours, and he had a lot to say about this. Anyway, I think these ones speak for themselves. But it is interesting, the casual moralisation which is coded in, that, you know, high saturates are in some way, you know, just fundamentally almost evil by the system. To break a red light is to, you know, put people's lives at risk in your car. You should do the same with your food. Naturally, the thought comes that a lot of this has more to do with caring for citizens and also something to do with the management of citizens to maximise economic productivity and so on. This is a cynical discourse, but nevertheless it's a discourse that exists, that actually the management of gluttony is about the perfection of an economy. Notice here, weighing down America, the health and economic impact of obesity, medical economic costs, $1.42 trillion a year. To put it in terms of a cost, like your gluttony has a cost, it costs the nation something. If we measure the value of a nation by GDP, then you're costing it by doing this. Your moral choices have an economic impact, apparently. And here we go, likewise, the greatest threats to the global economy caused by humans, obesity. I mean, you know, look, I suppose I don't have any like profound thing to say about this. Maybe you guys do. I feel depressed by these images, but I'm not sure why. Andre, there's a microphone just here.
I'm wondering, when did this transition from medieval understanding of gluttony, of something which is bad because it distracts you from something more important, turned into criticism of gluttony because it makes your body worse? So when the ultimate purpose gets removed from the picture, and it just becomes all about body, right? It's not that body intervenes with something it shouldn't intervene with. It's about body doing something bad for your body, and therefore let's make our body better by not eating too much.
Yes, good question. I think I've obviously skipped a few centuries here. I think probably we could focus more on the 18th and 19th centuries when I think that those kinds of discourses begin. Does anyone else know? Yeah. No, well, it's my problem. Supposedly. Well, no, on medieval, but not modern. I don't know the answer to that. I feel like I've made a TFY presentation, I'm not sure. The traditional answer to this would be that it's with secularization, and we would identify it with the 18th and 19th centuries. More, but we would have to dig into the discourses around bodies in the 18th century. That would be the place to go.
But I just thought, coming back to your previous question, is that this, as you described, at least the medieval practice is not biopower. Because biopower means states on the biological level. You want to control biology because you have certain purpose in biology, right? You need certain types of bodies. Whereas in the medieval picture, you just need to get rid of biology. And this is not biopower, it's just not allowing biology to play too much a role.
Yes, but then, yes, you're right. Or maybe Julie has an answer.
Well, I don't have the answer. It's just normally, so biopower is not the manipulation in Foucault, it's just the way to describe a certain state of, or how power, it's a Nietzschean sense. It's not the manipulation, just everything that there is, how it's organized. And for him, contemporary power is something that springs from the sovereign power. So the power of taking care, and biopower is presented, the discourse of health, which is the example of pastoral power and biopower. It is presented, and this is taking care of a health, right? But it's presented as taken care, but for real, there is not the manipulation, but this is how it organizes body from inside. So, and this is the Christian tradition, because the same is as in Aquinas, it was presented as taking care of not bodies but souls, right? And next, the contemporary discourse was the health care has the same roots, but this taking care of a body, and by this manipulating people, making them more thin or less fat.
Yes. Okay. It doesn't fit perfectly. It's not. But still, nevertheless, there is a certain ideal. There is a certain desire to manage the biology, which is grounded in what? Grounded in a vision of moral perfection, which is realizable. I don't think for Aquinas it's getting rid of biology necessarily. I think by Aquinas' time there's much more of a sense that the body is the instrument of salvation. It's inseparable from your salvation. Aquinas is not a Manichaean. He doesn't want to deny the body. The body is necessary to your salvation. It's an instrument of it, and so consequently, management of biology is completely foundational to salvation. But yes, it doesn't fit perfectly by any means. It's not. I wouldn't say it's biopolitical in the sense that it's not tied up with the state and it's not tied up with. Are you saying that there are certain? What are the certain goals? I mean, so you think the goal is essential in Foucault's vision of biopower?
No, on the contrary, there is no goal for him. There is no bad people who are manipulating other people or like government manipulating. It's just how everything new discourse that organizes a certain values that produce certain type of objects, and its functions with it functions as a taken care. And it's subjective. You believe that there is a health system that taken care of you. so you're trying to be less fat. And so this discourse of biopower, Foucault saw sometimes see as the transformation of Christian one. And Christian one was taking care more of the soul, but body was important as something that you can help the soul with, like punishment. The earlier types of terrible punishment, it was presented as taking care of the soul. You have to suffer in this life, so we are helping you to get better afterlife or whatever. And now it's just this life, so we need to be healthy now. And the body, it's not the punishment, it's just the taking care of it, but still through some limitations.
Interesting. So there's almost a vacuum where a point to all of this management is. There's a vacuum almost of where that point could be, or should have been, or could have been, or was. Yeah, look, we'll move on. Yeah, Archam, you want to say something?
I wonder, and going back to medieval time, did they use Jesus as a fitness model? Because he was, well, according to what images I know, he was pretty fit. And as example for Christians.
Well, look, the students will remember very vividly last week Hadovik of Brabant, and maybe Valeria and others and Leona will remember. For her, Jesus was the ideal man physically, extremely physically, and she had a sexualized desire for Jesus, which she manifested in visions of pressing their bodies together, and the contours of Jesus is blah blah blah. This was quite important for her, right? So there are idealizations of Jesus' body, definitely, as a fitness model. Oh my goodness. Well, yes, of course, in the sense that, do you want to be like the apostles? Well, I'll only eat what I'm given. I'll live in a kind of state of poverty. We're back to Francis of Assisi, for whom, you eat whatever you're given. This is what Jesus would have done, apparently. I don't know how he quite arrives at the point that Jesus wasn't fussy about his food, but there's a sense that you don't choose, you just accept, that you float on the breezes of life and accept whatever food comes your way, as Jesus and the apostles did, like in a life of mendicancy. So the idea is that begging, mendicancy, is the life of the apostles, that poverty and begging was how they lived. So like for Francis of Assisi, it's like, it doesn't matter what you eat. You could eat a lobster pie. It was actually a lobster pie in one of the stories. I love this. Imagine a lobster pie. But they happy to eat that. Yep, great. Francis of Assisi, happy to eat all the animals as well. Not such an animal lover as we think of him. As happy to eat, because precisely the problem is being fussy. Live like a mendicant. Eat whatever comes your way. That's what Jesus did. Andrea.
Yeah, I have a question. So if you compare gluttony with the hunger, right? Was there a similarity observed? Because a hungry person cannot think about the final purpose. Also, they are fussy about the food. They really pay too much attention just because they're hungry. So, yeah.
You anticipate brilliantly slide number 56, which is exactly where we're going with that. So you'll see, yes, there's a great anxiety also about that. We'll get there with vivid examples, which is why we should probably move on. I'll just quickly say that in the United States in particular, discourses, we talk about the vacuum of possibility of what the point of all this moralization is. Why shouldn't you be obese? Well, because it costs money, because this, because that, because it's an index of certain problems of education. In certain studies in America, like this negative association with just the word obesity, people start to think of certain social groups, people think of certain issues of class and so on. And then I'll move to Lauren Berlant, actually. Maybe this point doesn't quite tie up with that. Lauren Berlant is someone who's written about obesity. Her article, Slow Death, is quite a good one. I suppose the point she makes is, among other things, she illustrates that obesity is a problem without a cause for it to be a problem. Like it's a floating problem. Like we find certain moralizations that suit in certain situations. But why Sputnik? Why this image? This is this fascinating theory that when does obesity become such a problem in the United States? When does it become such a problem? When does the morality of overeating hit American popular commentary. Obviously I've got this image. You'll just have to imagine how it relates to Sputnik. But it basically became a state and federal topic during the Cold War when Sputnik and the rise of product plenitude in the US combined to create anxiety about the weaknesses of America's children. Maybe this kind of answers your question, Andre, in a shorter, like when in the 20th century do we get obesity anxiety and for what reasons? Well, late 50s, early 60s, and about the weakness of America's children. So now the management and creation of perfect bodies is also to be perfect bodies for the United States in a cosmic battle with their rivals. All right, let's move on from biopower, which maybe I was just introducing to you, but students, I think you should check out some of those readings. Let's move on to feast and fast. And this is where we will ultimately, slide 56 is coming, it's not that far. Look, there's a central point here, isn't there, that Christianity is a religion obsessed with eating, because at the center of Christianity is a ritual of eating, a ritual of cannibalism, as it was described by Islamic commentators, eating the body of Jesus Christ, drinking the blood of Jesus Christ. You know, I'm sure from the Gospels, Jesus says, take this and think of me, and referring to bread and wine at the Last Supper. But this was defined by the year 1215. This is an important date for medievalists. We love this year. It's the most important. Magna Carta was 1215. But more important than Magna Carta, I think Genghis Khan invades Beijing. But more important than either of those things was the Fourth Lateran Council. This is like this extremely diverse and incredible council, which actually, if you want to talk about the history of management of bodies, I think the Fourth Lateran Council is a fascinating one. This is where Jews were forced to wear yellow stars for the first time in the diktats of this council. All kinds of laws about what lepers can and can't do, and so on, heretics. But anyway, this is where we get this idea that the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist are actually present. They're not metaphors, it's not a symbol. You're not just drinking and thinking about the blood, you're actually drinking the blood itself. As Peter of Poitiers said just so wonderfully, the blood of Jesus is in the wine like a hand is in a glove. That's kind of a creepy image, isn't it? But it's there, it's within. You can't see it, but it's there. It's giving shape to the wine. There is one universal church of the faithful, outside of which no one at all is saved. Start with an uncontroversial statement. In this church, Jesus Christ himself is both priest and sacrifice, and his body and blood are really, really contained in the sacrament of the altar under the species of bread and wine. The bread being transubstantiated, there we go, into the body and the wine into the blood by the power of God. This is, I know you can imagine how significant this is, but it's really significant. It's a huge bomb in a way in terms of what this Eucharist means. You can trace from the year 1215 onwards, and of course this wasn't the first word on this. Peter of Poitiers, his hand in glove thing was actually before this by a few years. But from this time onwards, the Eucharist becomes more and more of a moment of obsession. And I mean, it really does, for some individuals, become an obsessive ritual of taking the blood and body of Christ and believing that it's present. Now, of course, there are jokes. All right, so let's have a look at there's the Eucharist being given by a priest. So, of course, there are jokes. Well, look, if Christ's body is present, like, which part of his body am I eating now? Is this the kneecap? What is it? So Thomas Aquinas solves this issue and says, every single part of Christ's body is present in every single particle of the bread. So it doesn't matter, you're not going to, break off his kneecap and then leave it and forget to eat it. It's all there. So that's easily solved. Likewise, the blood, which is fascinating when you think about it. So every single drop of the wine contains every single part of Jesus' body. It's a mystery, isn't it? It's a total mystery. Obviously, there are jokes. Yes, that's one reaction. The other reaction is actually total fear. Some people are terrified now to drink the wine and bread. So much so that they have to start a law that is, you must do it every year at least once. So what would happen is, and by the way, this goes to other theologians who say, it's enough just to look at the body of Christ. It's enough just to watch someone else drinking the wine. That's enough. For most of you, that's all you need. And of course, it comes to a point where people feel like they're unworthy. So if I start walking towards you, Artyom, with the body of Christ...
I'll be okay with that.
No, you'd be okay with that. if you were a particularly sensitive Northern European woman, usually women actually, who develop the most rich and complex and paradoxical obsession with this issue, is actually women. For other reasons, probably. Yeah, well, no, you'd just be terrified. You know, this is the idea that there's a certain kind of terror that goes with this. Margaret of Cortona is one writer, one woman who describes, like, I'm not worthy. I'm just terrified that if I drink the wine, I drink Christ's body, I'm not worthy of it. Like, my gut will, you know, it will reject my body, if you like. People trembling. We'll come back to the fear in a second. I just wanted to show you the pelicans. I've spoiled it now. I should have said, which animal is this? Part of this mythology grows the pelican. We get this image, the sacrificial mother, that apparently the pelican bird rips its own heart out to feed its children. Is that true? Is that what the pelican does? I'm not sure. Although I love these medieval animal theories, like the one that the beaver. How do I know what? How do I know it's a pelican? Well, these are pelicans. They're not actual. I'm sure they don't look like pelicans, but these are labelled as pelicans by the writers. I was going to say about the beaver, which auto-castrates itself to evade its prey. You know this? It rips off its own testicles and throws them so that whoever's hunting it goes after those instead. But this then becomes a medieval symbol of the priesthood. Because just like the beaver, which also castrates itself to run away, the priest has made himself chaste so that he can escape the predator, which is sin. Great example. The pelican is a symbol of Christ and the Eucharist, because in the Eucharist, you know, Christ has sacrificed himself, and we eat the body, just like the pelican mother rips out its own heart and gives it to its beating heart to its children. Wouldn't we all do that for our children? So there we are. So there's a pelican. Obsession and fear. Let's talk about Mary Douaniers. She is probably one of the most obsessive. She's not the most obsessive. I think she's second most obsessive in the great rankings, with Catherine of Siena we'll come to in a second. This is a particular, and of course the book, for anyone who's interested, is Holy Feast and Holy Fast by Caroline Walker Bynum, which is just a terrific book about this issue. Mary Douaniers is a saint, and she becomes obsessed with the Eucharist. She wants to eat Christ's body and drink his blood, and she wants to do it as often as possible. And so the description is, here we go, for it was the same to her to live as to eat the body of Christ, and this it was to die, to be separated from the sacrament by having for a long time to abstain. So living is only living if I'm eating God's body and his blood. And to not have those things is to die. I might as well be dead if I'm not having them. And when she was not able to bear any longer her thirst for the vivifying blood, sometimes after the Mass was over, she would remain for a long time just contemplating the empty chalice on the altar. It's a high level of obsession. It's a high level of asceticism. How would you react if you saw all of this? You know, it's what Andre's question earlier, you know, about in hunger, aren't you distracted? Isn't there something a little bit excessive about this? This anxiety bubbling for some people. Catherine of Siena, actually I should say, when we talk about fast, we'll come to that. Okay, so the very drinking of the blood and the eating becomes a matter of obsession for some, and they want to do it as often as possible. We also have this phenomenon called the Corpus Christi parade. This is, the book is Miri Rubin's book, Corpus Christi, which is the best one about this. But this is instituted from 1265 onwards, and it just shows the obsession with the holy food and the holy feast, which is, not only now are you kind of terrified of the wafer because it's God's body, but now we up the theatre by having a whole parade once a year for God's body, Christ's body. So they carry the wafer, the bread, and they elevate it and walk around the perimeters of towns, and people sort of swoon when they see it. People follow and feel very humble about it. So this is kind of the high watermark of obsession with the feast itself, the obsession with the eating of Christ's body. More food issues coming. Fasting. What about fasting? This is connected. I mean, Alan of Lille had written about fasting as being, the medicine to the soul and body. It preserves the body from disease, the soul from sin. It has medicinal effects. If Adam had fasted in paradise, he would not have been exiled into damnation. There you go, there's that idea again. But again, this can be taken slightly too far, can't it? Or can it? So should the ideal Christian fast themselves to death? Is that the answer? Should the ideal Christian abstain? Well, the students will remember that Simeon the Stylite, who one of the great ascetics, who stood on a column for 40 years. There was just a column in Syria, and he stood on it for 40 years, and people would like small amounts of food would come up to him. But, that was his ideal, to sort of run out of food and be stuck on his column. So there's one ascetic ideal, which to abstain from food is holy, right? You're holier when you abstain from food. Hunger is something somehow divine. You can focus more. But should you go to the point of death? Well, Catherine of Siena is one example of this. I just got four things. I mean, she became so hungry that she lost the use of her legs. She ate so little that she lost the use of her legs. She was not able to actually walk. She induced vomiting through bulimia, right? So she would put sticks down her throat to vomit, which is, of course, a phenomenon that we're familiar with at some point. What did she eat? We'll get this one out of the way first, shall we? The pus and ulcers of the poor. That's true ethical eating, isn't it? If you really want to be ethical, you'll only drink the pus. I don't know why I'm looking at you, Arthur, I'm sorry. But, okay, so this is pretty extreme. It's not without precedent. Francis of Assisi was a big hugger of lepers, and he used to like kissing the wounds of people afflicted with great skin diseases and things like that. It's a great humility topos in the Middle Ages still. But of course, her ideal was to only eat Christ's body, for her, the only substance of food that would go through her system to be the Eucharist itself. And that was kind of her ambition, and that's what she kind of did. She refused all food but the single host way. When people did kind of insist that she eats more, she would stick things down her throat. When she was getting really, I suppose when the legs were giving way, she might get extra nutrition through is nutrition the word? This is extreme. Actually, we still have Catherine of Siena's skull is a relic. It was just too disturbing for me to use in the PowerPoint, but you can Google. It looks like only 3 teeth made it through that process. No, she is. The thing is, it's uncomfortable. Catherine of Siena is a holy figure within Catholic Orthodoxy or within Catholic Church, and certainly is worshipped as, I believe she's a saint. I'm not so sure. But of course, there are anxieties around this behaviour. What kinds of anxieties you can imagine? Anxieties about, well, Andre already anticipated them. So if I'm not drinking the pus of the poor, am I not doing it right? If I'm not going to this extent, is this somehow less than? Is there, this is the modern phenomena of when someone is more abstemious, are they implying that we too should, none of us have these anxieties anymore, I think, because it's the 21st century now, but certainly in the 1990s or 80s when, people were uncomfortable about vegetarianism because they saw it as a moral judgment on others, like, do you judge me for eating animals, and so on. Well, I think there's a similar anxiety here that it makes all eating seem pathological. And so we look at some of the writers who write against this. And this is slide 56, actually, Andre. This is the one. You should know the virtues of kindness and charity instead. You should show the virtues instead of observing a severe abstinence. This is for Cassian. Cassian makes it clear, fast all you like, but number one, you don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone you're doing it, because there's no need to tell people that you're fasting. It's a private act of penance or self-discipline. But once you start telling people, then it becomes unkind, and it can actually oppose charity, as he says. So for Cassian, it's pretty good. So if someone comes around and says, what are we eating? You don't say, well, actually, I'm eating nothing. Sorry, guys, I'm actually fasting. This is unkind for Cassian, which shows a certain level of reason. As you might expect, or we'll go to Pseudo-Bernard, next, Pseudo-Bernard, someone pretending to be Bernard of Clairvaux. Nor should you believe in any way that it is a greater virtue to abstain from food than to make use of food in moderation. What would Catherine of Siena have thought of that? Well, she would have rejected that. So it's a warning against believing that there's a virtue in no food at all. And then, of course, Aquinas we rely on for his principle of right reason dictating action. Reason does not refuse food to the extent of rendering us incapable of discharging our duties. So quite simply, your body needs to function, otherwise you're useless. So yeah, those are some of the criticisms. Let's finish up then with anxieties and fixations. And this is a brief part of the lecture. and it's the modern part. So any questions about medieval practices before we move on? Things you wanted to know? Because the second lecture today, we will not be discussing food or drink. This is the end of that discussion. The second lecture will be reflecting on the nature of sin, the nature of evil, the nature of moral choices, more generally, reflecting on the last 7 weeks, the 7 sins. So this is your last chance. Artyom, I can see you're itching.
That time, those who fasted, and did they try to recreate the model of, when Jesus fasted in desert, or it was sort of, I don't know if it's correct word, to redeem that sin of Adam and Eve. Sort of. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
So, which model? I mean, if you can say so, they use. Why they did that?
The model of Jesus comes up over and over again, unsurprisingly, and also Jesus was tempted by three great temptations, and that was one of them. So, yeah, those are the 2 things that come up over and over again. Adam and Eve, not so much. Actually, in popular discourse,
Like you punish yourself for that.
yeah, that one comes up in some of the sermons and some of the foundational works on gluttony, but that one doesn't come up in sort of popular consciousness about fasting. People aren't saying let's fast because the forbidden fruit. They're saying let's fast. Jesus fasted, and it clears the mind and it keeps away temptations of other kinds. Interesting.
And how official?
Oh, one other thing I should add, by the way, that we haven't touched on is the importance of the connection between gluttony and lust. Is one that we haven't talked about at all. Remember, in Dante, lust comes after gluttony. For Gregory the Great, lust comes after gluttony as well, in his concatenation of sin. Like, each sin leads to another. And it's important, this. And there's an argument that, in contemporary world, we have a lot of eroticizations of food, but in the Middle Ages, there's actually an alimentarization of lust, which is to say that lust is seen as an outcrop of gluttony, of an obsession with the earthy, an obsession with temptation for things that satisfy the body. So you're preparing yourself for lust by gluttony, which is interesting. We didn't really talk about that. That's an item I thought I should mention. So a reason to fast is to also keep away that other temptation that can come.
And the saints you mentioned, or what's her name? What was her name?
You want Catherine of Siena?
Yes. And people like her, as far as I understand, Catholic Church that time look at them favorably, and they were examples, right? But at the same time, you say and you showed us that they warned people from doing it like too much. How does it connect it? Because she was kind of a model of God-fearing woman, and at the same time they say that you shouldn't try to do it by yourself to that extent.
Look, this is one of the great worries of medieval theology. There are certain individuals that do certain things which, for whatever reason, are sanctioned. But then someone can do the same act and not be sanctioned. Classic example, Peter Valdez, Francis of Assisi. They have the same program, the same practice. They want to practice poverty. They want to own nothing. They want to, live life in imitation of the apostles. Valdez is condemned. Francis of Assisi is made into a great saint. What's the difference? Why? Arnold of Brescia, 1140s, same message as Francis of Assisi. He's burnt at the stake, he's hanged, his ashes are thrown in the river, and he's written out, his damnatio memoriae, he's written out of the history of Rome, like it's illegal to write about him, basically. Whereas Francis of Assisi is on every fresco. Same practice. But this is the paradox of medieval Christianity. There's no rule. It's the right time, right practice at the right time gets the right pope who accepts it, and it gets canonized. And then it's for theologians and historians and people like us to sort of wonder, like, how did this paradoxical behavior fit? How did it become, and how does it fit and others don't? And then you can make nitpicking differences. You can say that, and so your Saint's Life of Catherine of Siena will say something like, she did it with a certain meekness and modesty, and she did it in a certain way that meant, or, it's interesting. But yeah, the tension's always there. Nothing quite fits. They're not flat pack saints, you know. Each saint makes a new sainthood. All right, so let's move on then to this final section. And look, this is just a bit of fun, really. Thinking that it would be fun, but it probably won't be. These are modern food anxieties, and I just thought we could talk about them for a second. Because in our process to think about how gluttony is pathologized today, where do we build the fences about our pathologies? Is it a moral issue, gluttony, or is it an economic issue, or a social issue, or a political issue, or what? I know they're all combined, but where are the fences, do you think, in the modern world? Clean versus dirty is the first, right? Clean eating. I suppose that in one way, it's enough to simply notice that there's this implicit moralization to eating, which crops up in the words like dirty and clean. The clean eating revolution is, I don't need to introduce it, right? I think the word clean eating actually comes about in the late 2000s, early 2010s. So it's actually fairly recent that you have the adjective modifier clean about certain kinds of eating, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with these kinds of diet books, detoxing, dieting. What's interesting, actually, I did this practice a few years ago where I read the introduction to every single diet cookbook, and a lot of them actually feature the same narrative. And it's often one of, I was lost in my life, I was not enjoying my job, my mind was always foggy, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't even like myself. And then I discovered, you know, the NutriBullet blender. And I'm not mocking it at all. Of course not. Look, of course, it also involves more willpower than I, for example, possess. But nevertheless, what's interesting to me, and I did this study of like 12 different ones, so it's not really a scientific study, is just how important the moralization of clean eating is. Likewise, dirtiness becoming associated with certain foods. I don't have anything more sophisticated to say about this issue. I was hoping that some of you might reflect on it. Does anyone have a good example of a moralized discourse about certain food groups? Or we can move on. We can move on if it's not interesting. I don't know.
Meat eaters versus vegetarians or like vegans? Or
That can be moralized in quite a concrete way, though, can't it? Like the animal.
Meat eaters consume corpses and stuff like that. The dead little rabbits.
That's pretty solid, isn't it? You know, like there's some ethical aspects.
So you're almost a killer.
Sorry.
You're almost like you kill.
You're a killer. Yeah.
You're a killer. You kill little creatures and devour them.
Yeah.
Is it correct?
You're absolutely right. Yeah, of course. That's one of the, I would say, explicit moralizing discourses. Like vegetarianism is murder, meat is murder. Great album, The Smiths.
Or at the same time, I heard from one of the biologists, Russian biologists. Well, he's popularizing biology, and they have this discourse, and they actually like to mock slightly vegans and vegetarians because they say that there is scientific evidence, and it's been for a long time, that children specifically, when little children, when they grow up, they have to have various diet, and they specifically meat as well, because that's the way homos function due to evolution. And they say that, well, they say idiot parents. Okay, you're adult and you can do with you whatever you want, but quote, the idiot parents, they really idiots. Yeah, they say it's idiots parents who really introduces this veganism to little children who obviously can't judge themselves, and which cause slow development of brain. And they say so they blame them that, okay, you harm yourself, it's all right. You're adult, but you harm children, even your children, and that's immoral thing.
Okay, so
when they adult, they can choose for themselves. But so this is from another point.
This is one kind of. It's interesting. Is it in terms of being too picky about food? Actually, it's more like what Aquinas would call the manner or the what you're eating, right? The sumptuousness, and it's part of that subspecies of gluttony, I suppose. fussiness about food, right? So being vegan for children, right? So there the moralization is obviously that it's an intellectual one, that this is going to stunt growth or something like that. So, interesting. Okay. Well, look, clean and dirty, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious as well, like that this is a moralized way of speaking. Andre has...
I have a suggestion where we can move with that, and that's cannibalism. Yeah, you mentioned that, Christianity was accused of being cannibalistic religion, and cannibalism seems to be a kind of universal taboo, right? It's sort of, it's not clear why. So could you comment on the roots of this?
Today, the day that finally cannibalism as taboo is over. No, I think, why is it still a taboo?
No, how did it emerge? I mean, was it always like that? Is there a connection between Christianity in medieval Europe and our kind of view of cannibalism as something which is absolutely unacceptable, even if it's somehow inevitable, right, in certain situations?
Yeah, look, I can't answer this, but I know that, obviously there's all the discourse about the book of Genesis and the stewardship of animals, and that consequently animals were given for people to eat, right, in this sense. And obviously Christian anthropology makes the human special. So humans are not in any category. Humans should never be eaten under any circumstances in Christian discourse, right? There's no. But what about other discourses? I mean,
but you can eat God, but you cannot eat human. Isn't that kind of paradoxical, right?
It is paradoxical. It is paradoxical. It is a problem. It's a problem. It's a problem until we confront the fact that God is present as Holy Spirit in all creation. So anything you eat is sort of can be construed as God, and also because of the magic element, because it's not a body, because it's important that it retains the species of bread, right? It's not like we eat the flesh. It retains the species, it has the substance. There's a distinction between species and substance. It's okay to eat the substance of God, but not the species of God, right? No one wants to eat the relics except Hugh of Lincoln, of course, who eats the thigh bone of Mary Magdalene, but that's something else. That's something else, and he was in trouble for that. But he was so tempted. But so actually, there probably is an interesting side road about legitimized Christian cannibalism. I was once at a paper about sporagmos, by the way, which is the oh my goodness, what is it? The ancient Greek ritual cannibalism. Does anyone know about sporagmos?
I heard something.
I accidentally offended the questioner because this is why you should never go to the toilet during questions. I just went out the room for 2 minutes, came back, and I asked him the question, did this sporagmos practice actually happen? It turns out the previous questioner had asked the same question, and he got really upset, about the ethics of sporagmos, like we were accusing him of patronizing people in the past. Anyway, the point there I'm trying to make is it's debated whether or not sporagmos was a genuine practice or not. But there was allegedly a practice of ritualized cannibalism in ancient Greek society, which is legitimated. However, Andre, I don't actually know of any cannibalistic, I suppose there are. I don't know enough about cannibalistic cultures to know whether this is a specifically Christian distinction or whether actually cannibalism is the odd one out in this cosmic universe of anthropology, which I suspect it is. But yeah, there you go. We could look at sporagmos. Let's move on because otherwise we'll run out of time. Another moralization obviously is about behavior. This one is really clear cut for the parents of young children. In particular, the debates that come out about letting people eat too much of certain foods induces a certain kind of behavioral degeneration. Too much Coca-Cola, too many of these cakes, and you'll have bad behavior. This has been debunked many times that there's any link between attention deficit disorder and eating certain foods. Nevertheless, it persists. I find myself using it as a parent. Well, you just don't do it because otherwise, I sometimes find it's a problem without a direction. This is nevertheless it's an important pathologization. The most famous one. Anyone know what this image could possibly refer to? Has anyone heard of the Twinkie defense? Oh, this is a good moment. This is when, it's not a good moment, it's a tragic moment. You remember the activist Harvey Milk was assassinated in San Francisco, and the man who did it, he also assassinated the mayor, the other guy. His defense was called the Twinkie defense, which was he'd been in a state of mind where he was growing depressed, and he'd been eating nothing but these little candies called Twinkies, which are these like foamy sugary things. So they call it the Twinkie defense. Like he's diminished capacity, diminished responsibility for the crime of murder, double murder, because too many of these sweet things. So, the bad behavior, it's there. It didn't succeed, by the way, number one. And number two, this actual defense crops up a lot in trials. Not a lot, but it does come back in the legal world. But actually, he was saying it was his state of mind which led to him to a depression, which one of the symptoms of which was eating this stuff. So it's not necessarily a direct cause. Nevertheless, in this whole world of bad behavior and overeating, it's definitely out there as a moralization. And as I say, you just have to spend 10 minutes with a group of parents and small children, and you'll find yourself saying the same thing. Don't eat that, you'll misbehave. William Miller, writing an article on gluttony in the late 90s, actually made the shocking claim that actually the sin of gluttony, insofar as it's seen as a sin in the contemporary world, is actually an anxiety about ugliness. That actually the biggest sin of gluttony is disfiguring the body. And now, I'm interested in Umberto Eco's book on ugliness, which is fantastic, which makes a great claim that actually ugliness is a real problem in medieval Christian history. On the one hand, Augustine says, no one is ugly, because nothing in creation is ugly, right? Here's the paradox. It's a wonderful paradox that's coming. Nothing is ugly because we're all God's creations, right? Simple. So even the scorpion, there's this famous thing, you hold a scorpion in your hand, it's ugly, oh goodness, but it's not ugly because we're looking at it the wrong way. We need to hold it up to certain light, or we need to see it with a scorpion's eyes, blah, 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 blah. All things are beautiful in a certain way for Augustine. But this opens the door to a problem, which is, what about when we encounter something as noxious or that we otherwise code as ugly? Unfortunately, the syllogism that Augustine presents us with is, this is not part of creation. This is morally other. So Umberto Eco makes a wonderful point that within Christian anthropology, that opens up this space for ugliness being associated with evil, or ugliness being associated with being outside of creation, turning away from creation. There's some horrifying statistic, again, William Miller's article, some horrifying statistic that American children have more negative perceptions of the obese member of the class than they do of the bully. So there are lots of encoded problems here. Nevertheless, it goes without saying that ugliness is a construct of our own, and it goes without saying that certain associations with obesity and ugliness are arbitrary and also just not true for most of us. But nevertheless, I found that a provocative claim that actually behind all of these pseudo-moralizations, like it's about behavior, it's about certain things are cleaner for the body system, actually lies this really primitive, I think it's fair to say, anthropology or view of the human and what it does and what it means that makes ugliness its core capacity. Finally, death. We can't get away from it. Pathologization about gluttony and overeating comes back down to death a lot of the time. Heart disease, it's quite simple. This is a map of American heart disease. It looks a lot like the electoral map that we're going to be seeing, which is interesting in itself. Some cleaner states than others, Vermont, actually Colorado, look at that, completely free of heart disease except for Denver, or maybe Boulder, probably not Boulder. So that's where we should live. And then as you can see, Mississippi, Alabama. Death is obviously the floating condition for our concerns, the reasons for treadmills, the reasons for abstentions of certain foods, and the reasons for diets and so on. Supposedly, although I don't know whether death is actually the fourth of the four in terms of popularity. There's probably not much more to say about that. I can get rid of this disturbing graphic if you like, and we can just finish. So some questions to finish on. Questions for you, the students, to think about in relation to all of this. Are contemporary moralizations of food and drink comparable to medieval moralizations of gluttony? Do you actually think they're comparable? I mean, I've thrown some fairly superficial examples of modern moralizations. You can probably think of your own substantial ones. Are they actually comparable? At some level, the better question to ask is, where do the two discourses not fit? Where are the real intransigencies between a medieval moralization of gluttony and a contemporary one? We could answer that. I think we have answered that at some level in the lecture, but think for yourself about it. Is it fair to call Thomas Aquinas a biopolitical agent? Could we think of the NHS as theological, like the National Health Service saying, we need to cut obesity, blah, blah, blah? Could we think, what would happen if we thought of that as a theological project, a project in moral philosophy or moral theology? Likewise, is Thomas Aquinas a biopolitical agent? I think actually Julie and Andre had some good counter-arguments to that. But nevertheless, what happens to Thomas Aquinas when we put him through the biopolitical lens or whatever? Do we see a different St. Thomas? And finally, were obsessions with fasting and feasting part of the fundamental structure of Christian culture, or were they historically produced? We need to know more medieval history to know the answer, but some would argue, obviously, that Christian culture, the Eucharist and other things were actually a substantial, and the Garden of Eden, forbidden fruit and so on, created a structural framework in which issues about food were going to be essential, no matter which way Christian history developed. Food was always going to be at the center of it. Or actually, are they historically produced? Does it depend upon certain strange changes around about the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, anxieties and fixations on food, which we could historicize through all kinds of means, but we don't have time. Okay, guys, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate the audience. The final lecture will be, as I say, a general reflection about sin, morality, evil. There'll be a lot of evil, I think. We'll look at all 7 sins. It'll be a good recap for those of you who maybe didn't attend all of the 7 sin lectures to go back through them. And for the students, it will be hopefully a good primer for your test on Thursday. So that's the idea, rather than going into medieval feasting, which would have been tempting, but I think it might be more useful for you. Okay.